Nobody expects a standard wildlife rescue to end in a blood oath that alters the fate of the supernatural world. When 32-year-old sanctuary owner Abigail Preston dragged 33 freezing, half-dead timber wolves into her Wyoming barn during the most devastating meteorological bomb cyclone of the decade, she thought she was simply doing her job. She didn't know that wolves in the wild never travel in packs of 33. She didn't know that the massive silver-eyed black wolf bleeding out on her tarp wasn't an animal at all. And she certainly didn't realize that by stitching his wounds, she had unknowingly claimed the absolute loyalty and the heart of the most ruthless alpha king in North America. The locals in the Absaroka Range of Wyoming still talk about the blizzard of December 2022. The meteorologists called it a generational bomb cyclone. The ranchers just called it the White Death. Temperatures plummeted to 40 below zero in a matter of hours, and the snowfall was measured not in inches, but in feet. For Abigail Preston, the owner and sole operator of the Whispering Pines Wildlife Rehabilitation Center, the storm was a nightmare she had spent all week preparing for. Her sanctuary, a sprawling 50-acre property nestled at the base of a jagged mountain pass, was home to injured elk-rehabilitated bobcats and a few permanently disabled raptors. Dr. Gregory Hughes, the county veterinarian, and Abigail's oldest friend, had called her twice that morning, begging her to drive down into town before the roads became impassable. "Abby, I'm serious." Gregory's voice had crackled over the radio laced with static. "The plows are pulling off the highways. If you lose power up there, you're on your own. You can't save the whole mountain." "The generators are topped off, Greg," she had replied, staring out her cabin window at the blinding wall of white descending over the tree line. "I'm not leaving the animals. I'll see you on the other side of this." By nightfall, the wind was screaming like a wounded animal tearing at the reinforced steel of the enclosures. Abigail was in the main cabin, nursing a mug of black coffee by the wood stove when she heard it. It wasn't the wind. It was a howl. It was a deep, guttural sound that vibrated through the floorboards, a sound of profound agony and desperate command. Then came another and another, until the storm itself seemed to be singing a chorus of grief. Abigail grabbed her heavy parka, strapped on her snowshoes, and slung her emergency medical bag over her shoulder. She fired up her heavy-duty utility snowmobile, the headlight cutting a feeble yellow cone into the suffocating blizzard. She tracked the sounds for 2 miles, navigating blindly through the dense pine forest, until she reached the edge of Miller's Ravine. What she saw at the bottom of the steep, snow-packed drop-off made her heart stop. It was a sea of fur. Dozens of wolves were huddled together in a massive, swirling pile of bodies, trying to share body heat as the snow rapidly buried them. Abigail was a seasoned wildlife expert. She knew the biology. An average wolf pack consists of 6 to 8 members. A large pack might hit 15. As she aimed her high-powered flashlight down into the ravine, she counted. 20, 25, 30, 33. 33 wolves. It defied every known law of nature. But what truly paralyzed her was the creature at the center of the mass. The other wolves were frantically licking at him, whining in distress. He was a black timber wolf, but his size was monstrous, easily topping 200 pounds. His coat was a midnight void against the white snow, but his side was matted with thick, frozen blood. He lifted his massive head, squinting against her flashlight. His eyes weren't the usual amber or brown. They were a piercing, iridescent silver. "Oh my God," Abigail whispered, her breath puffing in the frigid air. "What happened to you?" She didn't have time to question the biological impossibility of the pack size. They were freezing to death. The Alpha was bleeding out. Without thinking, Abigail unspooled the heavy winch cable from her snowmobile, secured it to a sturdy pine, and rappelled down the slick face of the ravine. Wild wolves are notoriously skittish. A pack this size should have either fled at the sight of a human or driven by starvation and stress attacked her. But as Abigail's boots hit the floor of the ravine, the impossible happened. The silver-eyed black wolf let out a low, vibrating chuff. Instantly, the 32 other wolves parted like the Red Sea. They didn't bare their teeth. They didn't growl. They sat in the knee-deep snow, shivering violently, their eyes fixed on her with an eerie, unnatural intelligence. Abigail approached the giant black wolf. He was laying on his side, his breathing shallow and rattling. A horrific laceration tore across his ribs, but it didn't look like a bear swipe or a rock scrape. The edges of the wound were burned and blackened, reeking of an acidic metallic scent that made Abigail's nose burn. "I've got you," she murmured, kneeling in the snow and pulling a heavy thermal shock blanket from her bag. She draped it over his massive torso. "I'm going to get you out of here." What followed was the most grueling 3 hours of Abigail's life. The Alpha was too heavy to carry. She managed to secure him onto her emergency sled. When she began the slow, agonizing winch pull up the side of the ravine, the rest of the pack followed. They didn't scramble or panic. They moved in a synchronized militaristic formation, pushing the weaker pups and elders up the incline first. By the time Abigail dragged the sled into her massive heated quarantine barn, her muscles were screaming, and she was dangerously close to hypothermia herself. She opened the wide barn doors, and the pack filed in. 33 wolves stepped into the artificial light, shaking the snow from their coats. The barn doors slammed shut behind them, locking out the deadly storm. Abigail was trapped in an enclosed space with 36 apex predators. But as she looked at them, she realized she wasn't the one in danger. They were looking to her for salvation. The inside of the quarantine barn was a balmy 60 degrees, heated by an industrial radiant floor system Abigail had installed specifically for winter rescues. The air quickly filled with the sharp, musky scent of wet fur melting snow and the coppery tang of blood. Abigail stood near the barn doors, her hand resting instinctively near the tranquilizer gun holstered on the wall. She watched mesmerized as the pack organized themselves. There was no chaotic scrambling for the warmest spots near the radiators. Instead, the largest wolves, broad-shouldered muscular males and fierce-looking females, formed a protective perimeter around the center of the room. The younger and smaller wolves huddled inside that ring. They left a wide, clear path for Abigail to walk toward the sled where the massive black wolf lay panting. "Okay," Abigail breathed out, her hands shaking slightly as she pulled off her frozen gloves. "Let's see what we're dealing with." She rolled a stainless steel surgical cart to the side of the sled and turned on the heavy overhead examination lights. The black wolf flinched at the sudden brightness. "Shh, easy, big guy," she whispered, keeping her voice low and soothing. She reached out her hand, hovering over his snout, waiting for the inevitable snap of jaws. It never came. Instead, the wolf pressed his wet nose into her palm, letting out a soft whine. His skin was burning up. He was heavily febrile. With surgical scissors, she carefully cut away the matted fur around his side. The wound was catastrophic. It was a deep puncture and slash, extending laterally across his ribs. But what bothered Abigail the most was the tissue damage. It looked like a chemical burn, necrotic and grey at the edges. She flushed the wound with copious amounts of saline, wiping away the blackened blood. That's when she saw it. Lodged deep within the muscle tissue, scraping against the bone of his ribs, were fragments of metal. "Who shot you?" she muttered angrily, assuming it was a rancher's buckshot or a poacher's rifle round. But as she took a pair of surgical forceps and gripped the largest piece of metal, a hiss escaped the wolf's mouth. His entire body tensed, and a ripple of low growls echoed through the barn from the surrounding pack. The black wolf lifted his head, looked at his pack, and snapped his jaws once. Absolute silence immediately fell over the barn. Abigail swallowed hard. They're taking orders from him, even while he's half dead. She applied a local anesthetic around the wound, hoping it would take the edge off, and went to work. With steady, practiced hands, she dug into the muscle and extracted the first piece of metal. She dropped it into a metal kidney basin with a sharp clink. Abigail paused, staring at the fragment under the harsh surgical light. It wasn't lead. It wasn't steel. It was heavy gleaming and untarnished. It was solid silver. "What kind of poacher uses silver bullets?" she whispered to herself, a chill running down her spine that had nothing to do with the blizzard raging outside. It took her 45 minutes to extract 5 separate jagged pieces of silver from his flank. With every piece removed, the wolf seemed to breathe a little easier, the unnatural heat radiating from his body, beginning to subside. She packed the wound with heavy-duty antibiotics, stitched the lacerated muscle and skin with dissolvable sutures, and wrapped his massive torso in thick white bandages. Exhausted Abigail sank to the floor next to the sled. It was 3 a.m. The wind was still battering the barn, but inside it was quiet. 32 pairs of eyes watched her from the shadows. She should have gone back to the main cabin, locked her door, and slept. But leaving a critically injured animal alone on the first night was against her nature. She dragged a cot from the supply closet, set it up 10 feet from the black wolf, and collapsed onto it, wrapping herself in a heavy wool blanket. The rhythmic, synchronized breathing of the wolf pack acted as a bizarre lullaby. Despite the adrenaline, her exhaustion won, and she drifted into a deep, dreamless sleep. Hours later, Abigail woke with a start. The overhead examination lights had been turned off, leaving only the soft, ambient glow of the baseboard emergency lights. The barn was silent. Too silent. She sat up, rubbing the sleep from her eyes, and looked toward the sled. The black wolf was gone. Panic seized her throat. Did he wander off? Did he crawl into a corner to die? She scrambled off the cot, her eyes darting frantically around the dim barn. The rest of the pack was still there, sleeping peacefully in their protective rings. "Hey," a voice said. It was deep, gravelly, and entirely human. Abigail spun around, her heart hammering against her ribs. Standing near the utility sink, illuminated by the red glow of an exit sign, was a man. He was incredibly tall, easily 6'4", with shoulders broad enough to block out the light behind him. He was completely naked, save for the large white medical bandage wrapped tightly around his ribs. The exact same bandage Abigail had just applied to the wolf. His body was a tapestry of old, faded battle scars. He had thick, dark hair that fell messy and unkempt around his face. But as he turned his head to look at her, the breath was knocked entirely out of Abigail's lungs. Even in the dim light, his eyes caught the glow. They were a piercing, iridescent silver. "You missed a piece," the man said, his voice laced with exhaustion and an undeniable commanding authority. He held up his hand. Pinched between his fingers was a tiny, bloody sliver of silver. Abigail backed up her legs, hitting the edge of her cot. Her brain fractured, trying to process the impossible geometry of what she was seeing. "Who? What are you?" She stammered, her voice barely a whisper. The man took a slow, painful step toward her. The sleeping wolves around them didn't stir, but a few opened their eyes, watching him with unwavering reverence. "My name is Nathaniel," he said, holding her gaze with an intensity that made her blood run hot. "And you, Abigail Preston, just saved my life, which means my life and the life of my pack now belongs to you." For a full 10 seconds, the only sound in the quarantine barn was the rhythmic howling batter of the blizzard against the reinforced steel roof. Abigail's scientific mind, honed by years of biology degrees and veterinary field trauma, violently rejected the image in front of her. Hypothermia, carbon monoxide leak from the backup generator, sleep deprivation. Her brain rapidly cycled through every logical explanation for why a severely scarred, impossibly tall, naked man was standing where a 200-pound timber wolf had just been bleeding to death. "I'm hallucinating," Abigail whispered, pressing the heels of her hands into her eyes. "Doctor, Hughes warned me about exhaustion. I need to check the CO detectors." "You aren't hallucinating, Abigail," Nathaniel replied. His voice was a physical weight in the room, dropping an octave lower than any normal human's. He took another step, leaning heavily against the stainless steel surgical table. He was shivering, his bare skin flushed with a returning fever, but his silver eyes never left hers. Instinct overrode Abigail's shock. Hallucination or not, the man was bleeding and freezing. She moved on autopilot, backing up to the employee locker near the utility sink. She blindly grabbed a pair of insulated heavy-duty Carhartt coveralls and a faded flannel shirt she kept for emergencies. She threw them across the room. They landed at his feet. "Put those on," she commanded, her voice trembling, but finding its authoritative edge. "Now, before I decide to use the tranquilizer gun on you instead of the wolves." A ghost of a smirk touched Nathaniel's chapped lips. He slowly bent down, wincing as the muscles in his stitched ribs pulled and stepped into the coveralls. He didn't bother with the flannel, just pulled the heavy canvas suspenders over his broad, scarred shoulders. "Better?" he asked, leaning back against the sink. Abigail kept her distance, her hand hovering near the wall holster containing the dart rifle. "Who are you? What are you? And why are there 32 wolves staring at me like I just walked on water?" Nathaniel let out a heavy sigh, running a large, calloused hand through his thick hair. "I told you. My name is Nathaniel. Nathaniel Cross. I am the Alpha of the Owyhee Basin Pack. We control the territories from the Idaho border down to the Wind River Range." He gestured vaguely to the shadows where the 32 wolves were resting. "And they are staring at you like that because you hold my life in your hands. In our laws, a life debt to a human is absolute. By saving the Alpha King, you have inadvertently conquered the pack." Abigail let out a harsh, incredulous laugh. "Conquered I run a wildlife sanctuary, Mr. Cross. I rehabilitate bobcats with broken legs. I don't conquer mythical creatures." She pointed a shaking finger at his bandaged side. "Wolves don't turn into men, and they certainly don't get shot with solid silver shrapnel. Silver bullets are a Hollywood myth." "Hollywood got a few things right," Nathaniel said grimly, his expression darkening. "It wasn't a bullet. It was a fragmentation grenade casing. a customized explosive packed with silver nitrate and solid silver shrapnel designed specifically to bypass our healing factor and rot us from the inside out. Abigail felt the blood drain from her face. Who did this to you? A mercenary outfit operating under the guise of a private military contractor. They call themselves Apex Solutions, Nathaniel explained, his jaw clenching. But they were hired by Silas Mercer. He's the alpha of the Ironwood Syndicate, a rival faction operating out of Montana. He wants the Wyoming migration corridors. He knew he couldn't beat my pack in a fair fight, so he waited until we were tracking a rogue grizzly near the border and ambushed us with military-grade munitions. So you ran. Nathaniel's silver eyes flashed with a sudden, terrifying apex predator fury. The air in the barn seemed to compress. From the shadows, several of the wolves stood up. Their hackles raised low growls rumbling in their chests. "We did not run," Nathaniel snarled, the sound vibrating in Abigail's teeth. "I ordered a retreat because I was dying, and my pack would have stood in the snow and let Mercer's mercenaries gun them down to the last pup just to shield my body. We marched south into the storm to lose their thermal tracking drones. We sought the ravine to die on our own terms." He paused, his anger deflating as quickly as it had surged. He looked at Abigail, his gaze softening into something that felt entirely too intimate. "And then you climbed down a 60-foot drop in a bomb cyclone, hauled a 200-pound predator onto a sled, and dug the poison out of my ribs with your bare hands." Abigail swallowed hard, looking at the bloody silver fragments still sitting in the kidney basin on her medical cart. The reality of the situation was crashing down on her, suffocating and undeniable. If this Silas Mercer has thermal drones and mercenaries, Abigail said, her practical mind catching up to the danger, what's stopping him from tracking you here? "The storm," Nathaniel replied, looking up at the metal roof. "The blizzard creates a thermal blanket. Their satellites and drones are blind in a whiteout. As long as the snow falls, we are ghosts." "And when it stops?" Abigail asked, a cold dread pooling in her stomach. Nathaniel stepped away from the sink, closing the distance between them with surprising speed for a wounded man. He stopped just inches from her, towering over her frame. "When it stops," he said softly, "I will burn Silas Mercer to the ground. But until then, you are under my protection, and the protection of 32 wolves who now view you as their matriarch." The following morning brought no relief from the storm. The wind howled with relentless fury, piling snowdrifts against the barn doors that Abigail knew were easily 10 feet high. They were completely entombed. Inside the barn, the dynamic had radically shifted. When Abigail woke up on her cot, she found a steaming mug of instant coffee sitting on the metal supply crate next to her head. Sitting cross-legged on the floor a few feet away was a ruggedly handsome man with sandy blonde hair, wearing a pair of her oversized sweatpants and a thermal Henley. Abigail bolted upright, pulling the wool blanket to her chin. "Morning, Doc," the man said, offering a crooked, easygoing smile. "Don't panic. I'm Wyatt. I was the grey wolf with the torn left ear." Abigail stared at him, then looked around the barn. The massive black wolf was gone, replaced by Nathaniel, who was currently at the far end of the enclosure, speaking in low, harsh tones to a striking woman with long auburn hair. Another shifted pack member. The rest of the pack remained in wolf form, sprawling comfortably across the heated concrete floor, chewing on the massive deer bones Abigail had thawed from her deep freezer the night before. "How many of you can do that?" Abigail asked, pointing a hesitant finger at Wyatt. "Shift all of us," Wyatt said, taking a sip from his own mug. but it burns a massive amount of calories to maintain a human form in this cold. Nathaniel ordered the elders and the younger ones to stay in their coats to conserve energy. I'm his beta. Sadie over there. He gestured to the auburn-haired woman, is our lead tracker. We shifted to help you manage the space, and to keep our alpha from tearing his stitches. Abigail threw her legs over the side of the cot, rubbing her temples. This is insane. I have a degree in wildlife biology from Cornell. You violate the laws of thermodynamics. Wyatt chuckled. Yeah, we get that a lot. Drink your coffee, Doc. Nathaniel is driving himself crazy wanting to check on you, but he ordered us to give you space. Abigail looked over at Nathaniel. He was still wearing her Carhartt coveralls, his broad back to her. Even from a distance, she could see the tension radiating from his shoulders. She stood up, grabbed her medical kit and walked across the barn. As she approached Sadie, the auburn-haired tracker immediately stopped talking and lowered her eyes, taking a respectful step backward. It was a clear display of submission, and it made Abigail profoundly uncomfortable. I need to check your wound, Abigail said to Nathaniel, keeping her tone strictly professional. Nathaniel turned his silver eyes, locking onto hers. He didn't say a word. He simply unhooked the heavy suspenders and let the top half of the coveralls fall to his waist, exposing his heavily muscled, scarred torso and the thick white bandaging. Abigail snapped on a pair of blue nitrile gloves. She carefully peeled back the medical tape. The skin around the stitches was still angry and red, but the necrotic grey edges from the silver poisoning had miraculously begun to recede. The tissue was knitting itself back together at a speed that defied human medicine. The infection is clearing, she murmured, applying a fresh layer of betadine. Her fingers brushed against his warm skin, and she felt his abdominal muscles jump beneath her touch. She looked up, startled to find him staring down at her with an intensity that made her breath hitch. I heal fast, Nathaniel said quietly, his voice a low rumble. But I would have died in that ravine if you hadn't pulled the shrapnel out. I owe you my life. You don't owe me anything, Abigail replied, taping the fresh gauze firmly in place. It's my job. I fix broken animals. I am not an animal, Nathaniel said, stepping marginally closer. The scent of him pine needles wood smoke, and something uniquely masculine wrapped around her. And the bond that was struck when my blood touched your hands is not a transaction. It is a vow. Alpha. Wyatt's voice cut through the heavy tension, sharp and urgent. Abigail and Nathaniel both turned. Wyatt was standing near the emergency communications desk Abigail had set up in the corner of the barn. He held the heavy black receiver of her ham radio. The storm is breaking, Wyatt said, his easygoing demeanor entirely vanished. And we have a problem. Abigail rushed over Nathaniel right behind her. The static on the radio was thick, but beneath the crackle of interference, a voice was broadcasting on a loop. It wasn't the local emergency services. It sounded like military chatter. Target telemetry acquired. We have a ping on a Scandic utility snowmobile GPS beacon. Grid reference 49er Alpha. The winch cable was deployed into the ravine. Heavy tracks leading northeast toward the civilian compound, waiting for cloud cover to break for visual confirmation. Abigail felt the blood freeze in her veins. That's my snowmobile. I left it hitched to the tree at the ravine because the engine flooded. Nathaniel's hand shot out, gripping the edge of the metal desk so hard the steel buckled under his fingers. Silas Mercer's men, Sadie hissed, her eyes flashing briefly to a golden yellow. Apex Solutions. They found the blood trail. Abigail looked up at the high barn windows. The suffocating grey of the blizzard was beginning to thin, revealing patches of pale winter sunlight. The thermal blanket was lifting. They were no longer ghosts. "They're heavily armed mercenaries," Abigail said, panic finally creeping into her voice. "I have a tranquilizer gun and a bolt-action hunting rifle. They'll slaughter all of us." Nathaniel turned to her, the silver in his eyes blazing with ancient, terrifying authority. He reached out and gently gripped her shoulders. "They will not touch you." Nathaniel swore, his voice echoing through the barn like thunder. Behind him, the 30 wolves rose to their feet in unison, a chorus of low, blood-chilling growls vibrating through the concrete floor. "Let them come! They are about to learn what happens when you corner a king in his own kingdom." The sudden piercing silence of the breaking storm was far more terrifying than the howling wind had been. Through the frosted high windows of the quarantine barn, the sky shifted from a bruised, violent grey to a blinding, crystalline blue. The Wyoming sun reflected off the 6-foot snowdrifts, casting a harsh, unforgiving light across the 50-acre sanctuary. Abigail stood near the ham radio, her knuckles white, as she gripped the edge of the metal desk. The military chatter had ceased, replaced by the faint, rhythmic thumping of heavy machinery echoing off the Absaroka Mountains. "Snowcats," Nathaniel said. His voice was a low, dangerous rumble that seemed to vibrate in the very air around them. He had discarded the Carhartt coveralls entirely, standing bare-chested, despite the chill seeping through the barn walls. His silver eyes were locked on the heavy steel doors. "And at least one rotary wing aircraft. They are using the tree line for cover." "They can't just attack a civilian compound," Abigail argued, though the tremor in her voice betrayed her logic. "This is a registered wildlife rehabilitation center. The state knows I'm here. If they come in shooting, it's a federal crime." Wyatt, now fully shifted back into his massive grey wolf form, let out a scoffing sound that was half growl, half bark. Sadie, still in her human form, was rapidly pulling on a spare set of Abigail's winter gear. "Apex Solutions isn't a government branch, Abigail," Sadie said, her tone clipped and completely devoid of her earlier submissive posture. "They are essentially a private death squad, bankrolled by Silas Mercer's illicit mining operations in Montana. They don't care about federal law. If they find you here with us, you aren't a bystander. You're a loose end. They will burn this barn to the ash and blame it on a generator explosion." Abigail's breath hitched. She looked at the 30 wolves surrounding her. They were no longer the shivering, half-dead animals she had hauled out of Miller's ravine. They were rested, fed, and thrumming with lethal kinetic energy. They were a unified military force, waiting for their general's command. Nathaniel turned to her, the raw, primal authority radiating from him so intensely it made Abigail want to take a step back. "You have a reinforced basement beneath the main cabin, correct? The one you use for tornado protocols." "Yes, but it's 100 yards across the main compound," she replied, her mind racing. "And I'm not hiding in a cellar while heavily armed mercenaries slaughter my animals and destroy my life's work." Before Nathaniel could argue, the distinct, thunderous roar of a customized heavy-duty snowcat engine cut through the silence. It was close. Too close. "They breached the southern perimeter gate," Sadie hissed, her auburn hair whipping around as she moved toward the barn doors. "I smell diesel and cordite." Nathaniel's jaw clenched. He closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, and Abigail watched in stunned fascination as a ripple of communication passed silently through the pack. Without a single vocalization, the 30 wolves dispersed into the shadows of the massive barn flanking the primary entrances and utilizing the heavy steel animal enclosures as tactical cover. "Abigail," Nathaniel commanded, pointing a scarred, heavy finger at the utility loft above the quarantine pens. "Take your rifle. Take the tranquilizer gun. Get it to the high ground. Do not shoot unless they breach the inner perimeter. Do you understand me?" "I understand," she said, grabbing her heavy-duty Dan Inject dart rifle, a weapon designed to drop a 1,000-pound moose, and her grandfather's old .30-06 hunting rifle. She scrambled up the metal ladder to the loft, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She threw herself flat on the grated metal floor, peering through the small ventilation slat that overlooked the compound's main courtyard. Two massive matte black snowcats, retrofitted with reinforced armor plating and heavy treads, tore through the snowdrifts, coming to a halt 30 yards from the barn. The doors hissed open, and 12 men poured out. They were dressed in advanced winter camouflage, their faces obscured by tactical balaclavas and snow goggles. They carried suppressed, short-barreled assault rifles. A man who appeared to be the commanding officer stepped forward, holding a high-powered megaphone. "Abigail Preston!" The man's voice boomed, artificially amplified and bouncing off the mountainside. "This is Commander Hayes with Apex Solutions. We are tracking a pack of highly dangerous, diseased predators that migrated onto your property. Open the barn doors and step outside with your hands visible. We are authorized to use lethal force to contain the biological threat." In the loft, Abigail loaded a heavy red-tipped dart into the chamber of her tranquilizer rifle, her hands shaking violently. Diseased predators. Biological threat. They were laying the groundwork for a cover story. Down below, Nathaniel stood alone in the center of the barn. He looked up at Abigail, holding her gaze for one heartbeat, acknowledging her position. Then he looked at Sadie. "Open the doors," the Alpha King ordered. Sadie hit the heavy industrial winch button. The massive steel doors of the quarantine barn began to slowly groan open, revealing the bright, blinding snow of the courtyard. Commander Hayes raised his hand, signaling his men to raise their rifles. But there was no human standing in the doorway. With a roar that shook the snow from the pine trees, Nathaniel shifted. It was violent, explosive, and beautiful. In the span of a second, the towering, scarred man was gone, replaced by the monstrous 200-pound black timber wolf. His silver eyes blazed with ancient fury. He didn't hesitate. He launched himself out of the barn, clearing 30 feet in a single bound. The siege of Whispering Pines had begun. The courtyard erupted into chaos. The suppressed thwip, thwip, thwip of the mercenaries' assault rifles cut through the crisp air, kicking up geysers of white snow around Nathaniel's massive paws. But the Alpha King was impossibly fast. He didn't run in a straight line. He moved with erratic, terrifying geometry, a shadow darting through the blinding glare of the sun. He hit the first mercenary, like a freight train. The impact shattered the man's tactical vest, sending him flying backward into the treads of the snowcat. Before Commander Hayes could shout an order to redirect fire, the rest of the pack poured out of the barn. It was a masterclass in apex predatory tactics. The wolves didn't attack as a mindless horde. They operated in distinct, highly organized squads. Wyatt, the massive grey beta, led a flank of 5 wolves around the right side of the courtyard, utilizing the snowdrifts for cover, effectively pinching the mercenaries between the barn and the heavy machinery. Sadie, in her lithe golden-brown wolf form, took the left, systematically disabling the mercenaries by targeting their knees and the hands holding their weapons. "Concentrate fire on the black one," Hayes screamed over the din, drawing a heavy sidearm. "Bring the Alpha down." Up in the loft, Abigail's scientific detachment completely evaporated, replaced by a surge of pure protective adrenaline. These men were on her land, trying to murder the creatures she had sworn to protect. She peered through the scope of the tranquilizer rifle. A mercenary had scrambled onto the hood of the second snowcat, raising a specialized launcher designed to fire the silver shrapnel grenades Nathaniel had described. He had a clear shot at the Alpha King's exposed flank. Abigail didn't think. She exhaled, steadied the crosshairs on the mercenary's bulky shoulder, and squeezed the trigger. The heavy pneumatic thunk of the dart rifle was lost in the noise, but the result was immediate. The massive dose of carfentanil, enough to drop a charging rhino in seconds, hit the mercenary directly in the deltoid. He dropped the launcher, his eyes rolling back in his head, and collapsed off the hood of the vehicle into a snowbank out cold. Down in the courtyard, Nathaniel heard the launcher clatter against the metal hood. He snapped his massive jaws around a mercenary's rifle barrel, ripping the weapon from the man's hands, and looked up at the loft. Even across the distance, Abigail felt the weight of his silver gaze. It was a look of profound, terrifying gratitude, but the distraction cost him. Commander Hayes, realizing his squad was being systematically dismantled by creatures that moved faster than human reaction time, pulled a secondary weapon from his thigh holster. It wasn't a standard firearm. It was a heavy, modified revolver, loaded with solid silver rounds. Hayes fired 3 times. 2 rounds missed, burying themselves in the heavy timber of the barn. The third clipped Nathaniel's left shoulder. The sound the Alpha King made was not a yelp of pain. It was a demonic, earth-shattering roar of pure rage. The silver burned on contact, a sizzle of searing flesh cutting through the smell of gunpowder. Nathaniel stumbled his front leg, buckling momentarily. Seeing their Alpha wounded, the pack lost their tactical restraint. The courtyard descended into absolute savagery. Wyatt tore the side door off the snowcat to get to a sniper hiding inside. Sadie and 3 younger males pinned 2 mercenaries to the ground, their massive jaws clamped inches from the men's throats, waiting for the kill order. Hayes backed up his eyes wide with genuine terror beneath his goggles. He raised his radio. "Base, this is Unit 1. We have a localized breach. The target is hostile. Repeat, target is..." Nathaniel didn't give him the chance to finish. Ignoring the silver burning in his shoulder, the black wolf lunged. He didn't bite. He simply hit Hayes with the full weight of his 200-pound frame, driving the commander into the packed snow. The radio skittered across the ice. Nathaniel pressed a massive, blood-stained paw onto Hayes's chest, his razor-sharp teeth bared an inch from the man's face. A low, vibrating growl rumbled from his chest, shaking the ground. "Stand down," the growl seemed to say, "or die." The remaining 4 mercenaries, seeing their commander pinned and the rest of their squad either unconscious or held at the mercy of monstrous wolves, dropped their weapons. They raised their hands, trembling visibly in the cold. Silence rushed back into the valley, heavy and suffocating. Abigail climbed down the ladder from the loft, her legs shaking so badly she almost fell the last 3 rungs. She pushed open the side door of the barn and stepped out into the freezing air, her boots crunching on the blood-spattered snow. The wolves remained perfectly still, holding their captives hostage, but their eyes tracked Abigail as she walked toward the center of the courtyard. She stopped 10 feet from where Nathaniel stood over the terrified commander. The black wolf looked up at her, the feral, violent rage in his silver eyes slowly dimming as he registered her presence. He stepped off Hayes. The mercenary scrambled backward, gasping for air. Right there in the middle of the bloodied courtyard beneath the blinding Wyoming sun. Nathaniel shifted back into his human form. He was completely bare, his chest heaving, fresh blood streaming from the silver graze on his shoulder. He didn't care about his vulnerability. He only cared about the woman standing in front of him. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his deep voice cracking with exhaustion and raw emotion. He closed the distance between them, his large, warm hands coming up to grip her face. "I'm fine." Abigail breathed, her heart hammering, as she looked up into his intense silver eyes. "I'm okay. You're bleeding again." "A scratch," he murmured, his thumb brushing a stray curl of hair away from her forehead. He turned his head slightly, glaring down at the trembling Commander Hayes. "Tell Silas Mercer," Nathaniel commanded, his voice ringing with absolute chilling authority, "that the Owe pack is alive. Tell him his silver is useless, and tell him that if he ever sends his dogs to this sanctuary again, if he ever threatens the woman who holds my life debt, I will march my pack into Montana, and I will tear his throat out with my teeth. Do you understand?" Hayes nodded frantically, unable to speak. "Take your men, take your machines, leave the weapons, and run," Nathaniel snarled. Within minutes, the mercenaries had loaded their wounded into the snowcats. The engines roared to life, and the heavy vehicles retreated down the mountain pass, disappearing into the white expanse, leaving a trail of churned snow and defeat in their wake. When the sound of the engines finally faded, Abigail felt her adrenaline crash. Her knees buckled. Before she could hit the ground, Nathaniel caught her. His massive arms wrapped around her, pulling her flush against his warm, scarred chest. He lifted her effortlessly, holding her as if she weighed nothing at all. "I've got you," he whispered, pressing his face into her hair, inhaling her scent deeply. "I've got you, Abigail. You are safe, my queen." Abigail didn't have the energy to correct his title. She just closed her eyes, wrapping her arms around the neck of the Alpha King, as the 32 wolves of the Owe pack sat in the snow and let out a unified, triumphant howl that echoed across the roof of the world. The adrenaline crash hit Abigail Preston the moment she crossed the threshold of her main cedar log cabin. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind her, muting the sounds of the 32 wolves systematically burying the mercenaries' abandoned gear deep beneath the snowdrifts of the lower pasture. Inside the cabin was suffocatingly quiet, save for the low, steady hum of the Kohler backup generator kicking on to regulate the heating grid. Nathaniel followed her inside, ducking slightly to clear the doorframe. He was still shirtless, the harsh winter light from the bay windows highlighting the sheer volume of faded silvery scars mapping his chest and back. Fresh blood trickled down his left arm from the silver graze on his shoulder, staining the worn denim jeans Wyatt had managed to scavenge for him from Abigail's spare guest room. "Sit," Abigail commanded, her voice raspy but firm. She pointed to the heavy leather armchair by the stone fireplace. "Before you bleed all over my Persian rug." A faint, almost imperceptible soul tugged at the corner of Nathaniel's mouth. The terrifying, godlike Alpha King, who had just dismantled a private military squad, simply nodded, walked over to the chair and sat down. He watched her intently as she moved to the kitchen to retrieve her secondary medical kit and a bottle of rubbing alcohol. "Wyatt is securing the perimeter," Nathaniel said quietly, as she knelt beside him, snapping on a fresh pair of nitrile gloves. "Sadie is monitoring the ham radio for any secondary chatter from Apex Solutions. They won't come back today. Hayes is a coward, and Silas Mercer doesn't have the capital to launch a second offensive blindly. And tomorrow?" Abigail asked, her hands remarkably steady as she cleaned the burned edges of his wound. The silver had seared the flesh, but already the supernatural cellular regeneration was kicking in. The tissue was knitting together in real time, pulling the edges of the burn closed. Nathaniel's silver eyes darkened, Tomorrow, I take my pack and we cross the border into Idaho. We will draw Mercer's attention away from the Absaroka Range. Whispering Pines will be safe. I will ensure the Wyoming Game and Fish Department believes the structural damage to your barn was caused by the bomb cyclone." Abigail stopped wiping the wound. She looked up, her brow furrowing. "You're leaving. I have to." Nathaniel said, the gravel in his voice thickening with a heavy, unspoken sorrow. He leaned forward, ignoring the sting of the alcohol on his skin, closing the space between them. "I brought a war to your sanctuary, Abigail. You are a healer. You rebuild broken things. I am a weapon of violence, and my world is drenched in blood. The absolute best way I can honor my life debt to you is to disappear and make sure Mercer's syndicate never looks in your direction again." Abigail stared at him. For 10 years she had lived alone on this mountain. She had poured every ounce of her soul into the Whispering Pines Wildlife Rehabilitation Center, choosing the company of injured raptors and orphaned elk over the complexities of human connection. She had convinced herself that isolation was safety, but as she looked at the Alpha King, a man who had thrown his massive body between her and a hail of gunfire, a man whose pack had treated her with more reverence and respect in 24 hours than humanity had in a lifetime, a profound, undeniable truth settled in her chest. "No," Abigail said. Nathaniel blinked, the sudden defiance catching him off guard. "No, you aren't leaving," she stated, tossing the bloodied gauze into a waste bin. She stood up, crossing her arms over her chest, fully embodying the authority she used to command the sanctuary. "Let's look at the facts, Nathaniel. You have 32 wolves. Half of them are still recovering from extreme hypothermia and caloric depletion. If you march them into Idaho right now, into hostile territory without a secure base of operations, you are leading them to a slaughter." "Abigail." "I'm not finished," she interrupted, taking a step closer until her knees nearly brushed his. "I am the registered owner of 50 acres of prime, federally protected mountain territory. I have industrial-grade quarantine, barns, a subterranean bunker, high-capacity meat freezers, and enough medical supplies to run a triage center. Silas Mercer isn't going to ignore me, Nathaniel. Hayes saw me shoot his heavy weapons expert with a Dan-inject dart rifle. I am already in this war." Nathaniel let out a ragged breath, reaching out to gently grip her wrists. His hands were massive, calloused, and radiating an immense, comforting heat. "I will not let my pack turn your home into a fortress. I will not let you become a target." "It's already a fortress," Abigail said, her voice dropping to a fierce whisper. "And you didn't just bring a war to my doorstep, Nathaniel. You brought me a family." Outside, a long melodic howl rose over the sound of the wind. It was Wyatt, signaling the perimeter was clear. It was answered by Sadie, and then a chorus of 30 other voices, a beautiful, haunting symphony of absolute loyalty and raw power. Nathaniel looked at her, his silver eyes wide with a mixture of shock and overwhelming reverence. The heavy burden of leadership, the exhaustion of constantly looking over his shoulder, seemed to fracture in the face of her unwavering strength. "You saved my life," Nathaniel whispered, his thumbs gently tracing the pulse points on her wrists. "When my blood touched your hands, the laws of my kind dictated that I belong to you. But I didn't realize that you were meant to be our matriarch. You are a queen in your own right, Abigail." "Then let me rule my sanctuary," she said, a small, genuine smile finally breaking across her face. "Tell Wyatt to pull the pack inside the main compound before the sun goes down. We have 200 pounds of venison to thaw, and we need to start fortifying the southern gate." Nathaniel stood up. The height difference was staggering, but Abigail didn't feel small. She felt anchored. He cupped her face in his hands, leaning down to press a soft, deeply reverent kiss to her forehead. "As you command," the Alpha King murmured against her skin. Mercer has no idea what he just unleashed. The storm of the decade eventually broke, but the landscape of the Absaroka Range was forever altered. Abigail Preston's life as a solitary wildlife rehabilitator ended the night she dragged a dying Alpha King out of Miller's Ravine, replacing her quiet isolation with the chaotic, fierce loyalty of the Oihi Basin Pack. What began as a desperate medical intervention evolved into an unbreakable blood oath, forging a permanent alliance between the human world and the supernatural. Armed with federal sanctuary protections, a tactical beta wolf and an alpha, whose devotion rivaled his terrifying power, Abigail didn't just survive the fallout of Silas Mercer's ambition. She became the undisputed matriarch of the most heavily fortified, fiercely guarded 50 acres in North America. Nobody expects a standard wildlife rescue to end in a supernatural war. But as Abigail learned sometimes, the only way to save the wolves is to lead them.